Reactive training systems.
Powerlifting programs are on a pretty broad spectrum when it comes to exercise selection. Some programs basically just use the competition lifts, and other programs hardly ever use the competition lifts. And then you've got all these different combinations in between. So I wanted to chat a little bit about exercise selection and how we go about exercise selection in reactive training systems. First of all, we have to be able to classify exercises, and to do that, just real briefly, we use three categories. The first is competition exercises. The second is assistance exercises, which are, in our language, are those exercises that are very closely related to the competition lift. There's just one or two small tweaks to emphasize a certain part of the movement. Some examples would be like pause squats or pin squats, or maybe squatting with chains, things like that. You're still squatting, but there's a small tweak that gives it some sort of emphasis. And then the third category of movement is supplemental lifts. For us, a supplemental lift is something that trains the muscle more than the movement. So to kind of build on our squat example that we're working with now, something like lunges or split squats, it's not the same movement pattern as your competition squat. It's significantly different, but it's designed to train the muscles. So using that classification system as a framework, we can employ several different strategies to bring about the results that we want to bring about. Competition exercises are pretty self-explanatory, but the way that you employ them can give you different effects. Most of the time, we're training our competition lift to drive competition results, to drive strength, to drive sport form, really. So that's the main thrust, and even within that, there's infinite number of different strategies that you can use. Where do you fall on the intensity scale, different periodization schemes and whatnot. But if your technique is not sufficient, and we can talk about what sufficient technique is maybe another time, but we can change how we train the competition lift so that it emphasizes quality technique as well. Now, when you get down to the level of assistance lifts, the exercise selection strategies open up quite a bit. Most of the time, we're selecting assistance lifts that target a weak range of motion. That seems to be where we get the most bang for our buck in terms of developing a lifter's overall strength, is by improving whatever their weak range of motion is. Now, to figure out their weak range of motion, first you have to do an analysis. Now, I can't really just talk you through an analysis in 30 seconds here, but the idea is to look not at the sticking point and not at some arbitrary range below the sticking point, but look for where the bar decelerates the most. Look for where they lose the most bar speed, and if it's not clear, then err on the side of a low range of motion. So bottom of the squat, bottom of the bench, and bottom of the deadlift. If you err more toward the bottom, it's going to have a better transference than if you end up a little bit too high. So look for where the bar is decelerating the most, and you could even use some software tools to help you with that. But to be honest, a detailed discussion of weakness analysis and correction is something that we get into in RTS Classroom very thoroughly, and I highly recommend those discussions. But for now, look for where the bar decelerates the most. Now, when you're selecting an exercise that targets that, what do you want it to accomplish? Well, you're already producing as much force as you can in that range of motion. You can't just decide to produce more. So how do we coax your body into producing more force in that range of motion? Well, to deliver a training effect there, we essentially want to practice producing force in that range of motion. Let's say we've got a lifter who shows a weak range of motion in the bottom of the bench press. let's say it's 1 centimeter off the chest to 4 centimeters off the chest, which is pretty typical for a raw bencher. At that point, we want to select some exercises that require them to practice producing force in that 1 centimeter zone. So 1 centimeter is pretty darn close to chest level. So what you could do is some long pause benching with the bar just lightly touching your shirt. Something longer than the competition pause. What that does is it's requiring the lifter to produce a significant amount of force, a significant amount of tension in that position. It's basically more training volume in that position, in that specific joint angle, than they would normally otherwise get. Other ways that you can do it, you could do a pin press in that position, where they're required to overcome inertia and overcome a barbell at a dead stop. So again, you're delivering training volume to that position. You're working on developing that position. And there's a bunch of other ways to do it too. Now, once you get down to the level of supplemental, you need to take your analysis one step further and figure out what the weak muscle groups are. That's not always an easy task. And to be honest, it's not just tied to the weak range of motion, but how you got into that position as well. So you have to look at the lifter's overall technique, and not just technique, is it right or wrong, but how do they move? You know, when they squat, do their hips rise first or does their chest rise first? Things like that are going to help indicate to you what the weak muscle is. So getting into weak muscle group identification is even more outside the scope of this talk right now, but I just want to start unpacking some of these ideas. Let's say, continue with our bench press example, let's say that you have a lifter who's showing weak shoulders. Well, in that scenario, you're going to want to select exercises that target the shoulders with a degree of less specificity. You don't want them, in that case, to basically be training the competition movement. You want them to train the muscle without training the competition movement. So things like overhead press are obvious choices, incline benching, stuff like that. If that stuff is problematic, if you have shoulder issues, you can't do overhead pressing, then you're going to be stuck with stuff that's more like delt raises and dips if they're possible, but often shoulder issues affect dips as well. But you just kind of have to get creative and select supplemental movements that target the muscle group that you're trying to fix.
Reactive training systems.